Senator Tom Cotton.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, hello. It's great to be back in the village with you. Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. Since it's April Fool's, I was going to start with the joke about President Obama and how he really understands the world and his policies are keeping us safer. But I was worried that I might give one of you a heart attack if I started that way. So I'm not going to do that. It is a real pleasure, as always, to be back in the village, capping off a great week here of the Easter recess. Started off with my son's first Easter on Sunday morning. So I want to start with a few brief comments, and then we'll move on to questions. And I want to talk first about something that I've heard from Arkansans all week long, and it's the threat of Islamic terrorism, and specifically the threat of the Islamic State, and address why that's such a threat and what we can do about it. So the Islamic State, as you know, has vast swaths of land in Iraq and Syria, as large as the state of West Virginia. They also control lots of Libya and now increasingly some of Afghanistan as well. They have affiliates in places like Egypt and Nigeria. The FBI has open investigations about the Islamic State in every single state of the United States. Obviously, they were responsible for attacks in Paris just 4 months ago and Brussels just last week. So I hear from a lot of Arkansans about questions about who these people are and why they want to kill us. Well, the answer is they belong to a radical, primitive ideology that is antithetical to everything for which the United States stands, that is medieval in its outlook, that denies the equality of mankind, that would enslave women, that doesn't believe in the freedom to practice one's religion as one chooses, to speak one's mind, to participate in a political process in which the rule of law is elevated above the rule of man. These people cannot be conciliated with, they cannot be negotiated with, they can only be defeated. And in some ways they're more dangerous than Al-Qaeda because of the territory they control and their willingness to attack anything and anyone at any time. Al-Qaeda frequently focused on big, sensational, symbolic attacks. That's why they tried to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993. That's why they did attack the World Trade Center in 2001 along with the Pentagon and attempted to attack either the White House or the Capitol with the fourth plane that went down in Pennsylvania. But the Islamic State attacks concert halls, movie theaters, parks in Pakistan. I mentioned that my wife and our baby celebrated our first Easter on Sunday. Over 70 Pakistani Christians went into a public park in Lahore on Sunday with their young children celebrating Easter, and they were specifically targeted by Islamic radicals. These are the kind of depraved savages that we're confronting. And I can't say that we're winning this war. We are not winning the war. Not when we see Americans being shot dead in San Bernardino, when over 300 people were maimed, murdered, or still missing just last week in Brussels. It does seem like there's more attacks in Europe than there are in the United States. Well, why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons. One, Europe is a lot closer to a lot of the fighting that's going on in the Middle East and North Africa, closer to places like Libya and Syria and Iraq, closer to Afghanistan. And migrants from those countries can go through Turkey and Greece and get to Europe. They can go on a short boat ride across the Mediterranean, get to Italy or Spain. Many of those are just people looking for a better opportunity in life, people trying to escape war. But we now know that the Islamic State has been smuggling its operatives through those refugees crossing into Europe and using them to attack Europeans. Europe also has a real problem with its internal borders. They have essentially open borders that people can move across freely. As the Brussels attackers moved across the border between France and Belgium freely. Europe has done a much worse job assimilating and integrating immigrants of all kinds, to include Muslim immigrants, to their land than the United States has done. Therefore, they have what are essentially no-go zones in places like the now infamous Molenbeek neighborhood in Brussels. When you see police officers on TV wearing masks, not the criminals, but the police officers wearing masks, because they fear retaliation against themselves or their families when they're going to places like Molenbeek or Saint-Denis outside of Paris. The United States has always done a much better job of integrating and assimilating immigrants from all lands who become part of the American way of life and cooperate effectively with law enforcement, whether it's local law enforcement or the FBI. Europe also is still divided. I mean, they have the European Union, but it's just a union of many different countries with many different languages, many different cultures, different bureaucracies, unlike the United States. Single country, one language, one FBI, one CIA, and so forth. Some European countries are even divided internally, like Belgium, between French and Dutch speakers. All that means that their security services, their intelligence services, their law enforcement services are not nearly as capable as are ours. And they obviously have much smaller budgets because they're small countries with only a fraction of the economy that we have. So that's to say Europe is more vulnerable than the United States is because we have an ocean between us and some of those troubled lands. We do a better job of assimilating and integrating immigrants of all kinds, to include Muslim immigrants, whom the FBI will tell you are oftentimes some of the very best leads for potential radicalization or even attacks. We have the world's premier law enforcement and intelligence and military services that have very big budgets, some of which I can't tell you about because it's classified, but you're very generous to them. They appreciate it. So for all these reasons, we are not as vulnerable as Europe is, but we are still clearly vulnerable. You don't have to go back to the 9/11 attacks. You only have to look at the attacks at San Bernardino and the Islamic State's expressed intent to attack America. It's not widely known that most Islamic State leaders were held in captivity by American or coalition forces during the Iraq War. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State, was held in captivity. And when he was released, he told the American soldiers working at that prison, "I will see you guys in New York." That's all you need to know about their intent to attack and kill Americans here. And they have the capability to take down an airliner out of Egypt. They have the ability to conduct sophisticated mass attacks in Paris and Brussels. The only thing they're limited by are some of those factors identified, but those factors are not enough. You cannot win the war on terrorism on defense. You have to be on offense. And unfortunately, President Obama just doesn't understand that. And it's not that he overlooks it or neglects it. He has the exact opposite viewpoint. He thinks you all and I and everyone else is just too scared of terrorism. You have a disproportionate fear of terrorist attacks. That's why last week when he was in Cuba and Americans were missing and terrorist suspects were still at large, he went to a baseball game with a communist dictator and did the wave. He compared himself to Big Papi, David Ortiz, the designated hitter for the Red Sox, who said that after the Boston Marathon attacks, the Red Sox weren't going to have their games canceled. We were going to show the terrorists. We were going to go on and play these games and continue our way of life. That is a great thing for Big Papi to do. His job is to hit home runs and beat the Yankees. The president's job is to keep us safe. And this, he reportedly tells people around him that more people die in America in bathtub falls or in vehicular deer collisions than die in terrorist attacks. So that we should get our priorities straight. And that may be the case. I haven't seen the date on that. It may be the case. But so what if it is? You can't weaponize a bathtub fall. I don't think the deer are in the woods plotting to get weapons that will allow them to kill even more Americans on the road the next time a vehicle hits them. That's what the terrorists are doing. That's why we have to go on offense. First, by recognizing this as a threat they are. Second, by taking the fight more aggressively to them in the places they are so they can't bring the fight to us here. That means we have to loosen the rules of engagement that our pilots are using in places like Iraq and Syria and Libya. We shouldn't have so many aircraft returning with so many bombs after sorties over Iraq and Syria. We shouldn't tie the hands of those pilots for months and months and months before they can strike, say, an oil truck that has been widely known to be supplying funds to the Islamic State, before they can strike facilities at the University of Mosul, which just today it was reported out the Islamic State is using as a chemical weapons laboratory. I shouldn't be hearing from heads of state or heads of intelligence services or militaries, as I do when they come to Washington, D.C. or when I go to the Middle East, that they're being denied approval for their own pilots to strike those targets. We also have to take into account our allies' interests and concerns more. If we expect countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan to provide the majority of the troops to fight against the Islamic State, and we should, and they're willing, we have to take into account for the fact that they are terrified by Iran and Iran's nuclear program and their missiles, and that we have to be willing to account for our allies' interests and help defend our allies against all the threats to them if we want them to put more skin in the game. And if our military commanders say that we need a few more troops in addition to the 4,000 that we have in Iraq and Syria right now, that we need to listen to that judgment and be serious about defeating the Islamic State militarily once and for all. Second, we need to become more aggressive in the collection of intelligence against the Islamic State. You heard a lot last week after the attacks in Brussels about the desire to share more intelligence. Oh, we need to share intelligence. We need to do a better job of sharing information. European countries are saying share more intelligence. You can't share intelligence unless you collect intelligence. And don't expect the United States to share our intelligence if you're trying to hamstring our collection of intelligence all around the world. That means that even though we sometimes have to kill terrorists to take them off the battlefield, it's always better to capture a terrorist for intelligence purposes. And when you capture a terrorist, the last thing they should hear is you have the right to remain silent. The first thing they should hear is, welcome to Guantanamo Bay, where you'll be spending the rest of your life. And when they're at Guantanamo Bay, they should be interrogated to the maximum extent allowable under U.S. and international law, because they can provide ongoing intelligence value that help us take more terrorists off the battlefield. When our intelligence agencies, who are some of the most capable in the world, as I mentioned, when they're trying to collect cell phone and text messages and other communications from Syria and Iraq that go through Europe and they incidentally impact European citizens, unintentionally, we shouldn't be giving foreigners privacy rights and our federal courts to stop our agencies from collecting those communications, because that's the exact way you get to a situation like we saw in Paris, where there's no advance warning of the attacks that were going to happen there. Third, we do have to take defense seriously, even though we can't win the war in defense. And the simplest kind of defense is genuine border security in this country. We've got it. I mean, obviously the threat of a homegrown terrorist is serious. We saw that in San Bernardino. But our southern border is still open to anyone who wants to cross it and who is intent enough to cross it. There is no reason for us not to have a fence on our southern border. It's not just an immigration matter, it is a matter of national security. Secondarily, we have something called the visa waiver program in this country. It's been a promotion of tourism and business travel, and that's a good thing. But I'm not willing to sacrifice American lives for American tourism. So, to countries in Europe like Belgium, who cannot get their own borders under control, who are not cooperating sufficiently with U.S. intelligence, we have to be willing to suspend participation in the visa waiver program until they take the steps necessary to ensure that their citizens are not radicalized and trained in Syria and coming here to attack our citizens. Absolutely. And because that's a real threat. Right now there are at least 2,000 Europeans who have gone to Syria and received training and come back to Europe. At least 2,000. After what we've seen in Belgium, given the capabilities of their service, which I have to say are somewhat representative of most European countries' intelligence services and law enforcement services, are we confident that we know every single European citizen who has traveled to Syria, received terrorist training, and is now back in Europe? I'm not confident of that at all. And any one of those citizens could get on an airplane and travel to the United States without a visa, without the kind of background checks that would otherwise catch that past activity. So those are just a few thoughts on the Islamic State and the war on terrorism. Questions I've been hearing all week long as I travel around Arkansas. I want to touch on a couple other brief topics before we get to questions that you may have been hearing about in the news. Public safety is foremost about national security and the war on terrorism, but it's also about safety on our streets right here in the United States. There's been an effort underway in Congress to adopt what some people call criminal justice reform legislation. I would call it criminal leniency legislation, because it would let repeat violent felons and drug traffickers back out on the streets. Now, I'll tell you what my view of sentencing is for low-level, non-violent, first-time drug offenders. I don't think we should lock them up and throw away the key. I don't think we should take a 19-year-old who gets caught with a marijuana joint and put him in jail. We should take action to get him back on the right path in life to make sure he remains a productive citizen. Someone who has back surgery and gets addicted first to prescription painkillers and then starts using heroin or some other opiate because of that addiction. I don't think we should lock them up and throw away the key either. We should try to get them the treatment they need to get back to being a productive citizen. That's my personal view. I can also tell you that's largely the policy of the state of Arkansas and the United States government. I can't vouch for every single state out there, but it is simply a myth that there are large numbers of low-level, first-time, nonviolent drug offenders in federal prison. There are a little over 200,000 federal prisoners. Less than 0.5% of them are in prison because of something like a drug possession offense. And most of those pleaded down from a more serious offense in exchange for a shorter sentence. I am open to the prospect that there are a handful of manifestly unjust sentences. I'm completely open to that. If that is the case, we shouldn't pass legislation that would let thousands of violent felons and drug traffickers back on the street. We should let the president commute those sentences. The #1 most prolific user of the pardon and commutation power in going back to the start of our party was Abraham Lincoln, one of the most merciful and charitable men who ever held that office. We should address manifestly unjust cases through that constitutional measure, not by letting violent felons back on the street. There are other things that we can do in our criminal justice system to reform it and make it work better for all of us, like focus on rehabilitation and redemption, even for people who deserve to be locked up in prison for a while. If they don't get the death penalty, they don't get life without parole, they're going to be back on our streets. So we should try to make sure that they don't go back to a life of crime. We should encourage Christian ministries in prison. We should promote GED programs and job training programs. We should have drug treatment programs. All of those are smart investments in our prison system to make sure people who get out of prison don't go back to prison because they can commit more heinous crimes on innocent citizens. We should reform the way our prisons work to make sure they're safe. Safe first and foremost for corrections officers, but also safe for the prisoners. Prison should be a place where we punish you for past conduct and we deter future conduct and we incapacitate you against present conduct. It should not be an anarchic jungle where every correction officer and every prisoner has to fear for their life. We can address the over-criminalization of private conduct at the federal level. You shouldn't have to worry about being thrown in jail or getting a felony on your record if you go into a national park and you disturb something that you didn't even realize was an Indian relic or something that was an endangered species. Without even the intent to cause that conduct or the intent to cause the result, which you hear too many horror stories about. So there's lots of ways that we could reform our criminal justice system and it would work for all of us. The way not to do that, though, is to let violent repeat felons back onto the street.
Exactly. Right.
So, third and final, since we're talking about the courts, the Supreme Court, and the death of Justice Scalia in February. First, no one is going to replace Scalia because he's irreplaceable. He's a great American, a great jurist, and a great man. Ultimately, someone will fill that seat, though, but it won't be before this election, if I have anything to do with it. It's a rare thing that the American people get a chance to decide who's going to control the presidency and the Congress. It's extremely rare that they get a chance to decide who's going to control the Supreme Court as well. But right now the Supreme Court is split 4-4. That means whomever we elect as president will nominate, and whomever we elect to control the Senate will confirm a Supreme Court justice who controls the balance of power in the Supreme Court. We are just a few months away from a presidential election. I don't know why we would not let the American people make that choice. They rendered something of a split decision the last two times we asked them to choose. In 2012, they elected Barack Obama to nominate judges, without any help from Arkansas, I would add. In 2014, they elected me and a net 9 new Republican senators to say stop to Barack Obama. Stop with the executive overreach, stop with the unilateral action, stop with the left-wing court packing. So now they have a chance to speak and render a final verdict. Who do they want? Do they want another justice like Nino Scalia, appointed by a Republican and confirmed by a new Senate? Or do they want a justice like Stephen Breyer or Ruth Bader Ginsburg? I personally prefer the first, but ultimately it's going to be the American people's choice. So I don't think that we should prohibit the American people from weighing in on this decision. And you can count on me to stand firm. In fact, last week, when the rest of the Senate was in recess, I was in Washington, D.C. I was the one person left behind, because it was my responsibility to gavel the Senate in and out of session. It only took about 30 seconds, to make sure that the President couldn't use his constitutional power to make a recess appointment. Now, I don't want to take all the credit. It's not just me. We've decided among ourselves that we're not going to let the President do so. So there will always be one senator in Washington during these longer recesses to make sure that we don't have more than a 3-day gap, which is the standard for preventing a recess appointment by the President. But I'll be back there again later this year. And it's important enough to us to represent your voices to make sure that you get this say that we're going to take time off from a family vacation. We're going to take time off from visiting you within our home states. We're going to take time off from meeting with the troops overseas to stay in Washington, D.C. whenever we're in recess and make sure the President doesn't preempt the American people's choices.
Absolutely.
So, those are just a few of the thoughts I have on my mind, and I've heard from Arkansas this week, or that you may have seen in the newspapers recently. So now, with that, I'm happy to open it up to questions, and then after questions, we might go into comments or even insults if we get that far. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is, you better be careful, the government might want to regulate the bathtubs. The question I have is, the House passes appropriation bills, but the Senate doesn't. Why, and what's the prospect for the next few months in this area?
You could go beyond appropriations bills, so the House passes a lot and the Senate passes very little. Partly that's the constitutional design. You know, our founding fathers knew that legislative tyranny had been a problem in the history of democracies. And they wanted to create a Congress, first and foremost, that was not efficient, but was safe to the liberties of the people. And therefore, they divided the Congress into 2 different chambers with 2 very different types of structures, which built 2 different sets of rules, which built 2 different sets of customs and informal processes. So the House is a very majoritarian institution, passes bills every day, is always voting frequently every single day. The Senate is a much slower institution, much more deliberative institution. Each senator has the power to hold up legislation. Sometimes that can be frustrating, but when I'm the one person who's objecting to a bill that I think is bad for Arkansas, I'm glad I have that power. And I bet most of you will be glad that I have that power if I can explain the merits of this or that bill to you. So that means that the House is always going to pass more legislation than does the Senate, and the Senate is always going to move a little bit slower. Sometimes that can be frustrating because we need a lot of genuine change in this country, but then I look back at times like 2009 and 2010, and I wish there had been a little bit slower pace when they were passing the stimulus and Obamacare and so forth. Now, about appropriations bills specifically, it is really important that we pass smaller, discrete spending bills that fund a specific department or agency, as opposed to what we had in December, what we've had in most years, which is a single, massive, 2,000-page, $1.1 trillion bill, which I voted against, which my default position is usually to lean no, because they don't hide the good stuff in those bills. The good stuff is all in the press release. The bad stuff is what comes out over time. And I found a lot of bad stuff in the 48 hours we had to review that bill, and it hasn't gotten better with time. We also, though, when we do that, up against a deadline, surrender most of our constitutional authority and leverage over to the executive. Whereas if you pass discrete spending bills well in advance of the deadline, we have a much stronger role to determine, based on your priorities, how we spend your money. And if the President vetoes it in May, well, that's no big deal. We've still got 3 or 4 months to work it out. So we're going to try to start in just a couple weeks on the appropriations process in the Senate, which will be the earliest it started in recent times. We'll see if the Democrats play ball. They said they would. Sometimes Mary Reid has a tendency to go back on what he said, but I'm hopeful that we can at least make some progress in that department this year.
Yes, Senator Cotton. I've been in the past, I'm very supportive and share your hawkish view on the prosecution of the war on terror, very much. My concern is, in all of this wiretapping and eavesdropping, that we become a surveillance state, and at the same time that we're giving up too much of our own liberties, and primarily just view politicians, quite frankly, in Washington have politicized the FBI in the past. We've seen it happen. We can't give unlimited power. So my point is, we have failed on human intelligence. We've built this huge NSA facility, and what have we done? We've ignored, Putin called the United States and warned us about the terrorists in Boston. Completely ignored it. And we had, again, the recent terrorist act in Belgium. They were warned by Turkey that these people were making designs on. Nothing was done. They dropped the ball.
Yeah.
So all of this surveillance, can we point to any successes? Because I don't see any. In all of these terrorist acts, all we're doing is, let's say we get somebody's cell phone and we're going to find out who did the crime.
Yeah. So let me take them in order: human intelligence,
Yeah.
and then signals intelligence, as it's known. It is a true statement that human intelligence is underappreciated and oftentimes maligned unfairly. The men and women that we have serving around the world trying to develop human sources are doing so at great peril to themselves and at great value to national security. That's true going back to World War II and throughout the Cold War and today as well. And we need to ensure that our intelligence services have the resources and the legal authority that they need to acquire more human intelligence. And that's whether you're trying to get access to the plans and intentions of a head of state, or if you're trying to identify terrorist cells and stop them before they can conduct an attack. Second, signals intelligence. So the 9/11 attacks very well might have been stopped if we had had the kind of authorities that were in place until last summer, because there was calls that were intercepted that were actually coming from the United States. But our authorities didn't know that because they didn't have the programs that were in place that I think we've unwisely done away with. Now, as someone who sits on the Intelligence Committee, I'm one of the primary overseers of these programs. And I can tell you, after having done that for 15 months and knowing a lot more now than I did when I was in the House of Representatives, not a member of the Intelligence Committee, these programs are not rogue, they're not running wild. If anything, they are smothered in oversight and caution. They're overseen by two different intelligence committees, by the leadership of both parties in both chambers, by an independent federal court on an individualized basis, and as a matter of its programmatic details. They are overseen by people in the Department of Justice, in addition to the Intelligence Community Inspector General. So there was robust oversight to the some of the programs that we let expire last year. I think that that's a real risk that we run going forward, because we've seen what happens in Paris and in Brussels when you don't have that kind of electronic surveillance possibilities. Does it impact citizens? I would say no, it largely doesn't. You know, if you look at the telephone metadata program, for instance, it didn't hear the content of any of our communications. It didn't even have any personally identifiable information. All it was, if you work at the spreadsheet, and putting it in kind of simple terms, is the data about the time of the call, the date of the call, the phone numbers involved, and the duration of the call. Now, that's what you might call a haystack. You pick up a terrorist, like after the Boston Marathon bombing, or after a Paris or Brussels attack, or you just arrest one because you've got a lead, and you get a phone number from his cell phone. You want to have that information available so you can see who has he been calling regularly. Now, some of those calls are going to be the local pizza joints, or maybe the dry cleaners. But if there is a phone number that gets called time and time and time again by a terrorist who just committed an attack, or by someone that we just rolled up in Mosul, or someone who we've got on a watch list in this country, I think that's a legitimate law enforcement lead that we should be looking into.
Just one follow-up. How about these 300 or 400 burner phones? Are the serious terrorists just going to react to us and take a different...
Well, that shows a degree of, the risk that I was saying about Europe shows a degree of sophistication, not just the burner phones, but the use of encryption, the bomb-making capabilities. And that is a way to get around some of the programs that were reported in the Edward Snowden leak. That's one reason why that leak was so damaging to our national security. And Edward Snowden, I think, is a traitor, should be tried for treason if Putin would ever return to our country. there are ways that law enforcement, but whether it's dealing with drug cases or whether it's dealing with terrorist cases, can address the burner phone issue. But it is a real challenge, but that's in part a result from what happened with Edward Snowden. Yes, sir.
In 2014 and now in the presidential election run, we over and over hear that conservatives are going to stop Obamacare immediately. In your opinion, even if we get a Republican or conservative in as president, what are the chances of stopping Obamacare? I keep hearing people say there's no way that's going to be replaced.
Well, I think that Obamacare is collapsing under its own weight, and it's continuing to do so as you look at insurers who are pulling out of insurance markets, premiums that are going up, many of which you've probably seen. I know we've seen it in our family, and doctors are withdrawing from insurance networks. The costs of Obamacare are spiraling out of control, far beyond what was ever estimated. The people that's actually covered, which is supposed to be the benefit of it, we pay all these costs and regulations and taxes and higher premiums, and we're supposed to cover more of our fellow Americans. It's just a small fraction of what was estimated in 2010 when it passed. So I think Obamacare is collapsing under its own weight. Now, in 2014, I always tried to be honest and measured in my promises that it was going to be hard to repeal Obamacare when the guy living in the White House was still named President Obama. But we were going to prepare the ground to repeal it and replace it with a genuine market-based, patient-focused healthcare system as soon as we got a new president. I still think that we can do that. And in fact, the Democrats are increasingly showing less desire to defend Obamacare and go down with the ship. In that spending bill last year, one of the good things in the spending bill, even though the bad outweighed the good, was the delay of two Obamacare provisions. The tax on high-value insurance plans, which impacted a lot of unions, one reason why the Democrats didn't like it, as well as the medical device tax, which has driven up the cost of medical devices, everything from artificial hips to crutches. That was done, by the way, because the medical device industry refused to play ball with Obamacare. That goes to show you that Democrats are no longer willing to sacrifice themselves on the altar of Obamacare. And with a new president who isn't so deeply and personally invested in Obamacare, Republican president, I think we actually can repeal and replace Obamacare with sound healthcare reform that focuses on controlling prices, so you don't see the spiraling out of control of premiums and copays and deductibles, and therefore getting more access to everyone. Because if you can reduce prices for any good or service, of course you get more people who are willing to buy it. That's right. That's what I think we should be focused on in 2017.
But as a quick backup, is there a plan, are there plans in the House of Representatives and Senate to replace it? I have not heard it. Here as a citizen, I haven't heard a whole lot of details.
Well, I would say there are plans. I wouldn't necessarily say there is a or the plan. So there are different kinds of plans. Part of that, though, is a result of being the opposition party. You know, when you're in opposition, you don't have a single voice to speak. That usually changes in a presidential year. Frankly, by this point, it usually changes, but we've got a little bit more competitive race this year than we've had in recent presidential campaigns. So it's going to be a little delayed this year before we have a single person who's representing our party and hopefully becomes our president. But at that point, I think you will see Republicans coalesce around a single plan. I think, sir, you've had your hand up over here.
What's being done in Congress, if anything, to address the problem of the national debt?
So the national debt, $19.2 trillion. I was visiting with some high schoolers earlier this week, and I asked them how many of them owed any money on a car or motorcycle or anything else that they owed money on. And not a single one of them raised their hand. I said, guess what? You actually owe $60,000 apiece. And it's probably a lot more than that because you're going to be around a lot longer than some of our seasoned citizens who owe that much money. So the two parts to getting our national debt under control. One is reducing spending, and two is getting the economy going. One of the small successes we've had over the last 6 years since Republicans won the House of Representatives is controlling spending from the explosion of spending you saw in the first 2 years of the Obama administration. Spending actually declined a couple of years. It's been on the uptick again, which I don't like to see, but that's one small success. But second, we've got to get our economy going. When you have a deficit that is $400 or $500 billion a year, when your debt is $19 trillion in sum, I don't think you can cut enough spending. When you look at the critical programs like Social Security and Medicare and our military and intelligence agencies and law enforcement, you can't cut enough spending to balance the budget. You have to get an economy growing faster than it has been. In the last 10 years, our economy has not reached 3% growth a year. That is still lower than what the post-World War II average was for decades. If the economy was healthier and growing, if more people were working, if more people were getting higher wages, you'd have a much higher tax base, and tax revenues would be growing, not because you're raising taxes on people, but because people are making more money, and they're spending more money, and that's a good thing. That's what we should want to see. Now, the president has been strongly opposed to any kind of tax reform that would reduce taxes on working families, get more people into the workforce, but it's something that we're going to have to do next year if we want to address the pace of economic growth. Second is that we have to reform our regulatory system. Many of you have small businesses, some of you may still have small businesses, and you know what an onerous burden it is to comply with the Department of Labor and OSHA and the EPA and on and on and on. Giant corporations have to spend a lot of money, but they have that money to spend. A small company that employs 11 people can't do it so easily. And those companies, at least in Arkansas, are the biggest source of job growth that creates new workers who are paying taxes. There's a couple ways that we're going to have to address our debt. We've had some small successes, but not nearly enough because of President Obama's stubborn opposition to any kind of pro-growth policy. Do you have, John?
Thank you. Well, we're both John.
Both Johns.
First of all, let me say thank you, Senator, for all the hard work that you do on our behalf every day. I know that recently you introduced some legislation about the refugees from Syria. I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about that and explain why that legislation was introduced.
Yeah, so I introduced a bill called the Religious Persecution Relief Act. As many of you may know, minorities in Syria, but especially Christians, also Jews and Yazidis, but especially Christians, given the numbers, are being targeted. Not just for discrimination, but for persecution and ultimately extinction. We're talking about communities that have been Christian really since the time of Christ. And even though they made up more than 10% of the pre-war Syrian population, they account for a very tiny fraction of the number of refugees that have been admitted to this country. Why is that? It's because of an unintentionally discriminatory effect in the way we process refugees in this country. We largely depend on the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees. And they do a lot of good work around the world. However, in the Middle East, when you have large numbers of people displaced, Christians, one, are nervous about going into refugee camps because they fear they might face discrimination or ill treatment from other refugees who don't share their religion. And two, they are understandably leery after 2,000 years of living as a persecuted minority in many cases, of putting their names on a government agency list when that list might be handed over to Bashar al-Assad's government if he remains in power in the long term. So, we don't admit Christians and other minorities like Jews and Yazidis and so forth at the rates you would expect, not just based on the population, but based on the intentional targeting of those religious minorities. Because, I mean, there's a lot of refugees and displaced persons in Syria and outside of Syria. The large majority of them are the result of the general war. But these small minorities have been specifically targeted for their beliefs. And we have a long history in our country of welcoming religious minorities. In fact, a lot of the people who came here initially, Pilgrims and Puritans, came here because of religious persecution. And I think that we should create a different pathway so Christians and other minorities don't have to go through the United Nations, so they can be granted harbor here in the United States. Now, I know we all, to include myself, are very worried about the safety of admitting any refugees from Syria. How can we know they are who they say they are? Well, in some ways, if you look historically, it's actually safer to admit members of persecuted minorities than just individual loners who walk in the doors and say, I want to come to America as a refugee. Why is that? Well, one, you just test them. Somebody walks in and says, I'm a Christian. It's like, oh, really? What are the four Gospels? What do they call the Thursday and the Friday before Easter? We've done that before. We did it with minorities in Iraq during the Iraq War, and the minorities from Iran that we've admitted for a long time. We did it with Jews in the Soviet Union when we had a special pathway for Jews to come here. So there are actual knowledge-based tests that you can assume anybody would know if they're claiming that they're a member of a persecuted religious minority. Now, of course, people can gain that, they can study, but the thing about religious minorities when they're targeted is they are often targeted as an entire community. So you don't get an individual loner coming in your door saying, I want to be a refugee. You have an entire Christian community that has been depopulated because they've been targeted for persecution and extermination, and they picked up and moved. So therefore, if someone comes in and says, I'm a Christian from this community, and I know my Gospels, and I know the parables, and I can prove that, you don't just have to take their word, you can go to religious leaders who are probably not going to want to immigrate because they're still caring for their flock. But they'll say, oh yeah, I know John and Judy. They were in fact in my community, they are in fact Christians. These religious minorities are often connected to churches and other communities in the West. So you can go to those communities and you can have verification for them as well. And we've seen this throughout our history of working with persecuted religious minorities. You've actually got a lot more information to check their claims against because of the nature of the persecution they face. And I, for one, think whenever we have an apocalyptic terrorist army that is both trying to kill Americans and exterminate Christians, we have a perfect unison of our national security interests and the moral sentiments of our people to help protect these Christians and Jews and other minorities from the extermination they face.
Senator, we have time for only one more question.
All right, one more question. Ma'am, you've had your hand up a couple times.
I would like to know why, there's a lot of people here, why people do not go by the old George Washington way of electing the president. Because we did not elect a Christian last time or 4 times. And we're not, and everybody loves somebody, I'm not mentioning his name, but I can't stand the man. He's not a Christian. He don't believe in forgiveness. I am a Christian. And I'd like to know why people are voting for the other people.
Well, I certainly wish we had a George Washington out there that we could elect, that's for sure. I am willing to say that I don't know any George Washingtons, not just in the Democratic Party, but in the Republican Party. But I do, frankly, I know some generals who would probably be, some retired generals who would be pretty good presidents if they would throw their name in the ring. But you know, if you look over the last 7 years, 7.5 years now almost, our country has become increasingly polarized and divided, and political rhetoric has become increasingly uncivil and coarse. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think we can have our disagreements, and we can do so in a civil and respectful manner. And then we can settle those disagreements at the ballot box. That's the way our country is designed. A lot of that, though, I think you have to put at the foot of Barack Obama and the promises he made versus the performance in office. Remember, this is a man who came to national fame in 2004 at the Democratic National Convention with a speech in which he said, we don't have red states and blue states, we're the United States. And I think that's a perfectly noble sentiment. He campaigned in 2008 as saying he was going to transcend the partisan divisions of the Bush era, that he was going to be nonpartisan or post-partisan. But since he's been in office, in particular since he was empowered with filibuster-proof majorities in his first years in office, he has governed in a way that has only worsened the political and partisan divisions in our country. And I'm hopeful that whoever we choose as a Republican Party will become a president who may disagree with Democrats on a lot of issues, but treats Democrats as opponents, not as enemies. Because we don't have enemies in America. We're all Americans, we're all fellow citizens of each other. We have opponents or rivals in politics. Our enemies are people like Iran and the Islamic State. And we should treat each other, whatever your political viewpoints are, we should treat each other civilly and with respect. And I see Vanessa back there waving at me. So that means I'm going to have to cut off questions. But I just want to say thank you all very much for coming out again. Thank you for your continued support and your prayers. It makes a big difference to me. It's an honor to serve you. If you ever need anything, not just from my office, but from the federal government, I hope you will know that you've always got an advocate in our office. And that means anything at all, you're bringing the grandkids to Washington and you want to tour, you've got a problem with the VA or Medicare, your child is overseas and lost a passport and needs a passport quickly, anything you need from the federal government, please know that we're always here to help you. May not be able to get you the answer you want. We can always help you get an answer promptly so you can put the matter behind you. So please always contact our office if you have any issues. We've got offices just down the road in Little Rock, but we're also just a phone call away. You can get our contact information at our website, cotton.senate.gov. Again, it's cotton.senate.gov. Thank you all very much. God bless you.